The gavel slammed. Silence. All eyes locked on the man in shackles. Marcus Reynolds, accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. The evidence? A grainy surveillance video. A vague description, a cop with a history of questionable arrests. But something was off. The footage was tampered with. The case built on assumptions. The system once again, ready to crush a man before hearing his truth. Would the courtroom uncover the real story? Or was Marcus already sentenced before the trial even began? The courtroom pulsed with restrained energy, a living, breathing entity of tension and expectation. Lawyers shuffled their papers, their hushed whispers blending into the background murmur of the spectators who filled the gallery. Journalists perched on the edge of their seats, fingers poised over notepads and laptops, eager to dissect every detail of the case about to unfold. The rhythmic clicking of a stenographer's keys provided an unsettling metronome to the proceedings. At the center of it all, Judge Olivia Carter sat at the bench, composed, authoritative, her dark eyes scanning the courtroom with an air of quiet control. She adjusted her black robe, the heavy fabric a constant reminder of her duty. This was supposed to be another day, another case, just another entry on a docket overflowing with names and crimes. But as soon as the bailiff's voice rang out, her world tilted. The state of New York versus Marcus Reynolds. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The name echoed in her mind, reverberating like a distant memory dragged violently into the present. She blinked, forcing herself into neutrality, gripping the gavel with fingers that suddenly felt unsteady. The last time she had spoken that name, it had belonged to a boy, reckless, brilliant, full of dreams, too big for the streets they grew up on. Now it was the name of a man accused of arson, attempted murder, and resisting arrest. She exhaled slowly, shifting in her seat as she glanced down at the charges before her. A fire that had nearly killed a real estate mogul, flames that reduced a luxury penthouse lobby to ash, evidence that placed the accused at the scene. And then the courtroom doors swung open. A pair of officers escorted the defendant inside, shackled, disheveled, unrecognizable. Yet there was no mistaking those eyes, dark, defiant, filled with something Olivia couldn't name yet. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The weight of the past crashed into her like a tidal wave. The courtroom waited. She swallowed hard, then forced herself to speak, her voice carrying over the tension that thickened the air. "Mr. Reynolds, you stand accused of arson and attempted murder. How do you plead?" Marcus lifted his head. His voice, rough from disuse, rang out, deliberate and unshaken. "Not guilty, Your Honor." For a moment, the courtroom faded. The weight of the robe on Olivia's shoulders, the murmurs of the spectators, even Marcus's unflinching stare, it all blurred into the background. Instead, she was 13 again, standing on the cracked sidewalks of Harlem, sneakers scuffed from running too hard, too fast. Marcus Reynolds stood beside her, a can of spray paint in his hand, laughing in that way that made the world seem less heavy. "Liv, you ever think about getting out? Really getting out?" She had rolled her eyes back then, pretending not to care, pretending she hadn't spent sleepless nights wondering the same thing. But Marcus, he never hid what he wanted. He saw the world for what it was, unforgiving and brutal for kids like him. They were an unlikely pair. Olivia, the daughter of a respected black professor and a white corporate attorney, lived in a Harlem brownstone her family had owned for generations. Marcus, on the other hand, had nothing but talent, wit, and the weight of a world that never made room for him. Their bond was simple. He made her feel alive, and she made him feel seen. But it was never that easy. People stared when they walked home from school together, whispering about how Olivia was too good for someone like Marcus. His own family warned him not to get too close. "They don't live like us. She'll leave you behind." Then came the night that changed everything. They had snuck into an upscale art gallery in Midtown, Marcus desperate to see the murals painted by artists he admired. He had whispered to Olivia, eyes alight with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. Then her father showed up. She would never forget the coldness in his voice, as he ordered her home, as he dismissed Marcus like he was nothing. "I told you to stay away from him, Olivia. He's trouble." Just like that, their friendship ended. Marcus stopped showing up at school, stopped answering her calls. Then one day, he was just gone. Until now. Now he sat in a courtroom before her, facing the kind of charges that could erase his future forever. And Olivia, for all her power, had no idea what to do. Olivia snapped back to the present as the prosecutor. Daniel Wright stood, buttoning his tailored navy suit with slow precision. His reputation preceded him, a relentless, methodical force in the courtroom, known for securing convictions that made headlines. He stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about destruction. It's about a man who, out of anger or revenge, set fire to a luxury building, nearly killing an innocent man. Olivia's fingers tightened around the gavel. The words felt like a blade to the chest. Marcus, setting a fire, attempted murder. She forced herself to focus as Wright laid out the evidence. Surveillance footage placing Marcus at the scene. Eyewitnesses claiming they saw someone matching his description fleeing as the flames erupted. A motive linking him to the victim. Wealthy developer Alan Whitmore, a man known for buying up properties in Harlem and forcing out long-time residents. It was damning, but Olivia had been a judge long enough to know that what looked clear-cut on the surface rarely told the full story. Her eyes flickered to Marcus. He sat motionless, jaw clenched, staring at the table, but beneath his hardened exterior, something was simmering. Olivia had seen it before, that quiet, unwavering defiance. As Wright continued, the weight of the past and the present collided. Had Marcus really done this, or was he fighting a battle no one else could see? The defense attorney Vanessa Brooks rose from her chair, smoothing the sleeves of her sharp grey blazer. Young but formidable, she was known for dismantling cases with precision. Olivia had seen her work before. She didn't just defend clients, she exposed the cracks in the system. Vanessa approached the jury, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her voice, smooth yet urgent, carried across the courtroom. The prosecution will tell you this is a simple case, that Marcus Reynolds is a criminal, that he set a fire with intent to kill. But that's not the truth. That's just a story designed to make you ignore the bigger picture. She let the words hang, then took a slow step toward the jury box. My client has maintained his innocence from the moment he was arrested. He was found near the scene, yes, but being in the wrong place at the wrong time does not make you guilty of a crime. She turned to the prosecution's table, leveling a cool gaze at Daniel Wright. You'll hear about surveillance footage. But what you won't hear is that the footage is grainy, unclear, that the figure in the video could be any man of similar height and build. You'll hear from witnesses, but you won't hear that those same witnesses described a suspect with different clothing than what my client was wearing when arrested. Vanessa's voice sharpened, her words slicing through the air. What you won't hear from the prosecution is how convenient this case is, how easy it is to pin this crime on a man who grew up in the very neighborhood Whitmore has spent years trying to erase. The tension in the room thickened. Olivia's pulse pounded as she stole a glance at Marcus. He sat motionless, shoulders squared, gaze locked straight ahead. He didn't flinch at the words being spoken about him, but Olivia saw it, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Vanessa turned back to the jury, voice softer now. Marcus Reynolds is not the villain of this story. He's a man fighting against a system that decided his fate long before this trial ever began, and we are here to challenge that. For the first time, Olivia wondered, was Marcus on trial for a crime, or for being the kind of man the system refused to believe in? The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Vanessa Brooks returned to her seat, her words still lingering in the air. Olivia exhaled, gripping the edge of the bench. She had presided over dozens of cases like this, where the prosecution painted a picture so clear, so damning, it seemed inarguable. But something about this didn't sit right. She studied Marcus, his posture stiff, his hands balled into fists in his lap. He wasn't looking at the jury, nor at Vanessa. Instead, his eyes were trained on the floor, his expression unreadable. The pieces didn't add up. The vague surveillance footage, the contradictory witness descriptions, the timing of the arrest. If Marcus was guilty, why did it feel like the case was built on shaky ground? A nagging doubt stirred inside her, a whisper she couldn't ignore. Had the system already decided Marcus's fate before the trial even began? As the trial resumed after a brief recess, Olivia forced herself to refocus. The prosecution called its first witness, Officer Gerald Dawson, the arresting officer. A seasoned cop with years in the force, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had testified countless times before. Prosecutor Daniel Wright wasted no time. Officer Dawson, can you walk us through the night of the arrest? Dawson nodded. We received a call about a fire. Witnesses claimed they saw a man running from the scene. We arrived at the area, saw Mr. Reynolds walking a few blocks away and detained him. Vanessa immediately stood for cross-examination. "Officer Dawson, did you see my client commit this crime?" He hesitated. "Not directly, no. Did you find accelerants or any fire-related evidence on him?" Another pause. "No." A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Olivia felt it too, a crack in the foundation of the prosecution's case. Had Marcus been arrested based on assumption rather than proof? The tension in the courtroom thickened as Officer Gerald Dawson shifted in his seat. Vanessa Brooks, poised and relentless, stepped forward, her gaze locked onto the officer. "Officer Dawson," she said, her voice calm yet pressing. "You testified that Mr. Reynolds was found walking a few blocks from the scene. What exactly made you believe he was the suspect?" Dawson squared his shoulders. He matched the description given by a witness. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. A description which was what exactly? He hesitated for the briefest second. A black male, medium build, wearing dark clothing. Vanessa let that hang in the air. That could describe dozens of men in Harlem that night, couldn't it? Dawson shifted. He was acting suspicious. Suspicious how? She pressed. He looked nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. Vanessa took a slow step forward. "Officer Dawson, would you say that if you were a black man in Harlem and suddenly found yourself being followed by police, you might look over your shoulder too?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dawson's jaw tensed. "I followed protocol." "Protocol." Vanessa repeated the word, letting it sink in. "You detained my client based on a vague description, no physical evidence, and the fact that he looked over his shoulder." Dawson's silence spoke louder than any response could. Vanessa turned to the jury, her voice shifting from pointed to deliberate. "Marcus Reynolds was not arrested because he was guilty. He was arrested because he was there." She let the words settle before delivering the final blow. And in this country, for some people, being there is enough to be convicted. Olivia felt her pulse in her throat. She scanned the jury's faces, some impassive, others shifting, questioning. She had always believed in the law's ability to find the truth, but now she found herself wondering, was Marcus Reynolds on trial for a crime, or simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time? For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if justice was being served, or if the system she had sworn to uphold was just another machine designed to crush men like Marcus before they ever had a chance to fight back. The weight of Vanessa's words settled over the room like a thick fog. Olivia glanced at the jury. A few leaned forward. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Doubt had seeped into their expressions, a crack in the firm wall of certainty the prosecution had tried to build. Marcus sat motionless, but Olivia noticed the way his hands tightened into fists. He had spent a lifetime fighting against assumptions. Was this just another battle he was destined to lose? For the first time, Olivia wondered if the trial was about Marcus's guilt, or about proving that the system could still be trusted. Vanessa wasted no time pressing deeper into the gaps in the prosecution's case. She called her next witness, Dr. Samuel Harper, a forensic analyst specializing in digital evidence. The courtroom quieted as the expert took the stand. "Dr. Harper, you reviewed the surveillance footage from the night of the fire. What did you find?" The analyst adjusted his glasses. "The footage is low quality, heavily pixelated. The individual in the video is unclear. Height, facial features, even clothing details are indiscernible." Vanessa turned to the jury. "So can you definitively say the person in that footage is Marcus Reynolds?" "No." A ripple of uncertainty spread through the courtroom. Olivia watched as the jurors took notes, their expressions shifting. Vanessa pressed on. "You also analyzed the timestamp. What did you discover?" Dr. Harper cleared his throat. "The metadata shows signs of tampering. The timestamp may have been altered." The prosecution objected, but the damage was done. Doubt had taken root. Olivia exhaled slowly. This was no longer a case of guilt or innocence. It was a question of trust. The evidence wasn't just weak, it was compromised. Had Marcus Reynolds been framed? Or worse, was this trial a smokescreen for a system that had already decided his fate before the first gavel ever struck? The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a battlefield where the very foundation of the prosecution's case was starting to crumble. Vanessa stood firm, pacing slightly before turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not just a case of mistaken identity. It's a case of manipulation." She turned back to Dr. Harper, her voice sharp. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, Can the footage provided by the prosecution be trusted as an accurate, untampered representation of the events that night? Harper hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. No, it cannot. The jury stirred. This was the turning point. Olivia felt her breath catch. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was about the integrity of the entire trial. Vanessa let the silence settle before delivering the next blow. If the footage is unreliable, if the timestamp was altered, then tell me what exactly does the prosecution have left? The prosecutor, Daniel Wright, immediately objected, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He knew, they all knew, this case was no longer airtight. For the first time since the trial began, Marcus lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. Had the tide finally turned? Olivia gripped the edge of the bench. She had always believed in the justice system, but if this case was built on falsehoods, what did that say about the system she had sworn to uphold? More importantly, if Marcus Reynolds was innocent, how many others had the system failed before him? The weight of the trial pressed down on the courtroom as Vanessa stepped back, letting the jury absorb the revelation. The evidence wasn't just flawed, it was unreliable, and if the prosecution's foundation had cracked, what was left? Daniel Wright, the prosecutor, stood with forced confidence. He had built his case on assumptions, faulty evidence, and procedural shortcuts. But now, with the forensic testimony exposing the tampered footage, he looked more like a man scrambling to hold a crumbling wall together. The footage is only one piece of the case, Wright argued. The arresting officer, the witness testimony. Vanessa cut in sharply. Officer Dawson admitted he never saw Marcus commit a crime. The witness couldn't even describe the suspect's face. And now we know the footage has been tampered with. A deep silence filled the courtroom. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were questioning. Olivia could see it in their faces, the slow shift from believing Marcus was guilty to wondering if this trial should have ever happened in the first place. Marcus sat motionless, but Olivia noticed his shoulders ease, just slightly. For the first time, it looked like he wasn't just waiting for judgment, he was waiting for justice. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people whispered anxiously, stretching their legs, waiting for the moment that would decide Marcus Reynolds' fate. When they finally returned, the foreperson stood, her hands trembling as she read the verdict. In the case of the state of New York versus Marcus Reynolds, we find the defendant. She paused, the room holding its breath. Not guilty. A mixture of gasps and murmurs filled the air. Olivia tapped her gavel, restoring order. Marcus let out a slow, measured breath, his expression unreadable. As the courtroom emptied, he approached Olivia's bench, his voice low. You knew this wasn't right, didn't you? She met his gaze. I did. As Marcus walked free, Olivia sat alone in the courtroom, realizing this trial wasn't just about him. It was about how many others never got their justice. Marcus Reynolds' trial may have ended, but his story isn't just fiction. It's a reflection of countless real lives caught in a flawed system. Every day, people face wrongful accusations, biased investigations, and legal battles stacked against them. The lesson: question everything. Demand accountability. Speak up. Justice isn't automatic. It requires vigilance. Whether serving on a jury, voting for leaders who push for fair policies, or supporting those unfairly accused, we all play a role in making the system work for everyone. Because if we don't fight for truth, who will?